Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2024 Minnesota Book Award finalists in the competitive general nonfiction category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota. My name is Teresa Waldof. I'm the author of Wilhelm's Way, the inspiring story of the Iowa chemist who saved the Manhattan Project, which recounts the life story of Dr. Harley Wilhelm, whose team at Iowa State produced over 2 million pounds of pure uranium for the Manhattan Project. Wilhelm's Way was last year's recipient of the Minnesota Book Award for General Nonfiction. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land on which most of us in this panel recording are participating from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we all work together to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by John Noltner, author of Lessons on the Road to Peace, self-published; John Rosengren, author of The Greatest Summer in Baseball History, How the 73 Season Changed Us Forever, published by Sourcebooks; Nate Patrin, author of The Needle and the Lens, Pop Goes to the Movies, From Rock and Roll to Synthwave, published by the University of Minnesota Press; Mary Tennis and Ned Netzel, two of the authors of Smoke on the Waterfront, the Northern Water Smokehaus Cookbook, published by University of Minnesota Press. Congratulations to each of you for the Minnesota Book Award finalist nod. I've been in your shoes, and I know just how exciting it is. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round-robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have a question or two specific to each of you and your wonderful finalist book. Let's get started. And we'll start today with John Noltner, author of Lessons on the Road to Peace. So John, my round-robin question for you is, tell me about your biggest challenge and greatest lesson during the research, writing, publishing of your book.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. The book Lessons on the Road to Peace really is a journal of a 2.5-year journey that my wife and I took around the country. So in the fall of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, we sold our house in Bloomington, Minnesota, and we bought an RV, and we spent 2.5 years traveling across the country. So the biggest challenge, I think, was the courage to let go of everything that we knew and hit the road, and learn how to live small and learn how to encounter difference, because we traveled the country and sat with difference. We went down to the border to talk about immigration. We went to Mississippi to talk about moving Confederate monuments. We went to Skid Row to talk about housing security. And so that process of being out of my own element and being comfortable with the notion of being uncomfortable was part of the process. And I think the greatest lesson was that willingness to encounter difference and challenge my own expectations, and when conversations got difficult, to commit to staying at the table.
Great. Next candidate for a round-robin question is John Rosengren. Tell me, John, about your biggest challenge and greatest lesson during the research, writing, publishing of your book.
Well, The Greatest Summer in Baseball History is a reissue of a book that was originally published 15 years ago. And so as it was about to be reissued, I thought I should go back and reread this so that I can speak knowledgeably about it in book interviews and book events. And as I went back, I did that with some trepidation because I wasn't sure if the writing would hold up and if I'd still like it. Fortunately, I did. But the thing that struck me most as I was rereading it is the similarities between George Steinbrenner and a recent president, and just what a egomaniac he was, how driven he was to please his father. And he was a liar and a cheater. And it was just striking. And of course, 15 years ago when I was writing this originally, I did not have the 45th president in mind. But those similarities really struck me. As far as what I've learned when I was doing the research is I love baseball. I grew up with the love of baseball that my father passed on to me. And this was the first book I did about baseball, and I realized just how wonderful it is to research and write a book about something I'm passionate about, a subject I'm passionate about. And I've written about a wide variety of subjects over the past 40 years, but this holds up as one of my favorites. So I learned that's important, to write what you love.
Excellent. Thank you. Nate, tell me about your biggest challenge and greatest lesson during the research, writing, and/or publishing of your book.
Well, I think for me, it's a matter of sort of branching out into a field that I've always been interested in, but haven't necessarily written as much about. For the most part, over the last 25 years or so of freelancing, I've focused on music, music criticism. I've freelanced for City Pages, Pitchfork, Stereo Gum, kind of like that general sort of music critic sphere where there's that sort of emphasis on kind of like figuring out the pop music canon and sort of like examining where things sort of intersect and fit together. And my previous book was about sampling and hip hop, so I had sort of at the back of my mind a sense of being very interested in the way that music can get repurposed and recontextualized. And the subject of my book was kind of branching up because even though I've been into movies pretty much as long as I've been into music, I haven't written as much about film. So I sort of had to kind of figure out figure out a bit of the language, how to kind of adapt that to my interests and enthusiasms, and sort of work out how these different things sort of intersect. And I mean, it's my second book, so I didn't have quite as many new things to learn just in the process of writing it as far as just sitting down and doing the work. It was still kind of a challenge to keep a steady schedule because I was also working on additional freelance gigs at the time. But I think when I'm in a state where I'm kind of working on multiple things at once, it does sort of help bring additional ideas and concepts to the forefront during the working process, and I get to sort of maybe throw some ideas back and forth between these different modes and see how they sort of develop and work in tandem.
Thank you. Mary Tennis, tell me about your biggest challenge and greatest lesson during the research, writing, and/or publishing of your book.
So I think for this project, my biggest challenge was really the group aspect, the team aspect of it. I've always written, by myself. It's always been so personal, so individual. And so branching out and including a team, trusting a team, and learning to have faith in that process was, it was in the end kind of magical, but it was really tough. It was a big learning curve. And I remember at some point, because we talked a lot about tone, right? We really wanted this book to be a culture piece, as well as being a useful book. So I remember thinking a lot about tone and really laboring over that, and really wondering, like, if we have these multiple authors jumping in, is this book just going to be a mess? Are we going to convey that culture that is so important? And reading over it line for line, word for word, sometimes multiple times as a group, I remember 2 years in reading reading a paragraph and thinking that it was mine, and then realizing it was Ned's. And it was just this extraordinary moment of like, we nailed it. This was pure synergy. And there was no more like ownership. It was kind of that dissolve into the process. And so it felt really good. And I learned so much as a writer in this.
Thank you. Ned Netzel, tell me about your biggest challenge and greatest lesson during the research, writing, and publishing of your book.
Yeah, of course. I have to admit right off the bat that of everybody on the team writing this cookbook, that I'm like the least knowledgeable of specific, like cooking techniques of like, being a chef. I'm not trained in any sort of way. A lot of what I do at the Smokehaus is assemble things that have already been made, right? But what drew me into the book really was kind of compiling it and doing like the archival work, looking through old binders and finding the recipes and kind of beginning the process of making what would become the cookbook after we wrote the whole thing. So the biggest challenge for me, I think, was figuring out how to speak authoritatively on a subject that I'm not necessarily an expert on, but using my like writing skills to make a book that's useful to anybody who's reading it. And the lesson that I learned from that was really to rely on the other people that I was working with, who are all like really smart with food. They get it. They're practiced in these techniques. And yeah, it just allowed me to flourish in trying to make something that is readable and accessible to whoever picks it up.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to go around and start talking, asking questions of each of you. And I'm going to just go in the same order. So we'll start with you, John Noltner, and your book of Lessons of the Road to Peace. And as I was reading your book, it is such an adventure of a year. I think it was a year, wasn't it? A huge adventure.
Yeah, 2.5 years on the road.
2.5 years, okay. And you talked to so many people, about 140 interviews, I believe you connected. And I'm just curious, there were so many. How did you select the stories to recount in your book? And which one of them had the greatest impact on you personally?
Yeah, it's a great question. The editing process is always a little heartbreaking. You have to always leave some things on the editing floor, and that does two things. It refines the message, and it lets you fit into the number of pages that you have available to you. But it's always hard to let go of some of those stories. The methodology as we traveled across the country was to meet people who are impacted by some of these social issues that we're dealing with as a country, and also to meet some of the people who are finding creative solutions to some of these really challenging issues. And so in the end, the editing process became a curating process. I found that I was a curator of stories, and I was able to sort of make sure that there was an interesting mix of perspectives, that there was an interesting mix of genders and ethnicities and experiences and ages in this process. And maybe 3 different people are talking about one particular issue, but one talks about it in a way that feels new and interesting and helps me to understand an issue in a new way. And so I was kind of guided by that curiosity. And I'm trained as a news writer. Spent my career working for national magazines, and so there's this sense that if something is interesting and curious to me, that hopefully it's interesting and gonna spark the curiosity in others as well. It's asking which is my favorite story is like asking which is my favorite child, and on some days I could answer that question, but on other days it might be a different answer. But one of the stories that really resonated with me was down in Tucson, Arizona. We were down near the border and along the border, again, talking about immigration. And I met Alvaro Enciso, who's a 70-year-old Colombian immigrant, and he's been a citizen in the U.S. for decades, but he's an artist, and he wanted to connect his art to his immigrant experience. And so one day he came across a map with the GPS coordinates of where migrants' remains had been found out in the Sonoran Desert. And there were like 4,000 dots on this map to mark where people's lives had ended as they were looking, to change their condition and their situation. And Alvaro started building these really beautiful wooden, colorful crosses. And every Tuesday he carries 3 of them out into the desert and places them at the site of those GPS coordinates to honor the lives of the people who were lost. And he says he's not particularly religious, but he likes the geometry of the cross. So the vertical line represents the person living, the horizontal line represents once they've passed, and the little red dot in the center where the lines intersect marks the moment when their dream changed and when they died. And so we went out into the desert with Alvaro a couple of different Tuesdays to help him place crosses. And when we were out there, he said that he really decided to do this art form because he wanted to use his art to help make the invisible visible again. And the simple fact that Alvaro's act is not going to change policy and it's not going to change conditions, but it's a personal response to sort of this human tragedy that unfolds out in the desert. And I thought it was a really beautiful and thoughtful response, and I was honored to spend a little time with him.
Well, that is very moving. So my next question for you, John, is your book, it covers so many topics and so many people in their different situations. And as the reader goes through this book, what do you hope that they will take away from the book?
Yeah. I mean, you raise an interesting point that the book really addresses all of these issues. I mean, frankly, we could have stayed along the border and continued writing stories about the borderlands and never exhaust that issue. And we could have talked about race in Mississippi and never exhausted that issue. So in some sense, it was difficult to keep moving, to pull myself away from one place that I had fallen in love with and then move on to the next place, only to fall in love and have to rip ourselves away from that the next time. But I wanted to be able to connect some of these threads. I wanted to be able to explore all of these issues and try to find some common themes in them. What I hope people take away from the book is a willingness to hear across some of the divides that we've created in our world today. A willingness to consider new possibilities, to challenge the expectations we all come to the table with, and be willing to hear the humanity of the people around us, and hopefully in the process, especially in this really tense election cycle that we're just launching into, that we're going to be willing to see that humanity in one another and take the time to hear those stories so that we can see the world in some new ways.
Thank you so much, John. It's time for me to move on to the other John Rosengren. And I read through your book, and you originally published it in 2008. And what drove you to rework it? And why was it important to you to do that? And in what way would you say that it's different from the original? That's a lot of questions in one question.
It is, but I think I can handle it.
Okay.
Yes, there's a lot of baseball. There's also a lot of America in it. And I thought on the 50th anniversary of the 1973 baseball season that those stories remained relevant because they're stories of race and stories of opportunity and of money and of ego and individualism. And while those are flourishing on the baseball diamond, they also are playing out in America then and now. And so I followed 5 storylines about each of those issues and thought that remained, like I said, relevant to today. And the reason I thought that should be, it was meritorious to republish and revisit those. The cover and the title were changed. We tweaked the interior a little bit to update it, but then the guts of the story remain the same. And so that's what you get today.
Okay, thank you. So my next question for you, John, is there were so many history-making moments and incidents in the 73 season. As I read through the book, I couldn't believe how much took place that year. Mm-hmm. Which one of them, though, because there were so many, which one do you think impacted the sport of baseball the most or the country? And why do you think that?
Well, there are several prominent things happening, and I was looking for a season that really did change the game and influence society at the same time. And so there's the introduction of the designated hitter rule. There was George Steinbrenner buying the Yankees and bringing this infusion of big money into the game. Willie Mays, the fading superstar, was passing the torch to Reggie Jackson, the emerging superstar, and the prototype of the modern superstar, you know, the chest thumping, look at me person who personified the 70s generation, but is carried over and remains 50 years later. But I think probably the most prominent story then and now was of Hank Aaron, a black man who was chasing a white man's reared record, the 714 career home run mark set by Babe Ruth. And it exposed the racism that perhaps many thought was in remission after the civil rights era and the movement of the 50s and 60s and the work done by Martin Luther King Jr. and others. The amount of hate mail that Aaron received and the threats, not only to himself, but to his children, his wife, were just this ugly reminder of the hate that continued to reside in the United States. And sadly, I think we've seen that in our country more recently. And so I think those are issues that are important to reckon with and continue to grapple with and discuss. And so this book does an opportunity to spark that, or there creates an opportunity to spark that conversation. Both as these issues play out within the world of sport, but also just within our country in general, because they haven't gone away.
Right. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Nate.
Yes,
Patrin. So, your book had a lot of different movies and music, and the combinations were interesting. They came many things that I had not even realized were there in the music, tying into those films. But, you know, it's an interesting topic, and I'm just curious, how did you come to realize the evolution of the use of music in film was really significant and enough that there was a book that needed to be written about it?
Well, I've always been kind of fascinated with the way that different forms of media sort of intersect. And while this wasn't exactly a lifelong process, it does go a ways back, because when I really started getting seriously into movies, you know, as a teenager in the mid 90s, sort of transitioning from, you know, the latest blockbuster or, you know, some big deal comedy is out. You know, I'd used to go to that, and then eventually I started, you know, diving deeper into like a more, you know, wide-ranging set of interests. And I noticed this relationship a lot. Like, I think for me, Pulp Fiction was one of the big ones. It came out in my senior year of high school, and the soundtrack was a pretty big deal because it was tied into this, you know, funny sort of, you know, Tarantino's kind of curatorial retro crate digging sensibility, you know, where he's kind of like somewhere between this sort of sense of kind of, you know, secondhand store junk culture camp and sincere nostalgia. And it's sort of, you know, erased a lot of the lines between high culture music and low culture music, you know, like, you know, Kool and the Gang and Surf Rock and an Urge Overkill cover of Neil Diamond, you know, sharing the same space. And it's all kind of like all on more or less the same level of sort of tastemaker coolness. But it also highlighted a lot of older stuff that, you know, people like me at that age might not have known about, you know, if I just stuck to MTV and the big music magazines. But then it really started kind of hitting home for me, you know, later in the decade when I started, you know, like really noticing this is kind of a sort of a specific mode, but like a succession of period pieces in the mid late 90s that for the most part, like were all taking place largely in the 70s. I mean, like at the same time, I was really doing my own kind of musical research and kind of like looking back to the past and trying to figure out, like how to engage with the previous generation's music. You had, Martin Scorsese putting together this sort of sardonic yet intense juxtaposition of classic rock hits in Casino. Spike Lee's Crooklyn had a huge repertoire of soul classics. Um, uh, Paul Thomas Anderson in Boogie Nights, he was kind of sort of almost trying to one up Quentin Tarantino when it came to having like exhibiting the sort of good-natured, secretly cool side of 70s pop kitsch. Boogie Nights is like a very enlightening sort of sense. It was almost kind of like the soundtrack equivalent of a Rhino Records comp. And Sofia Coppola, The Virgin Suicides, was really kind of revealed as sort of like a teenage girl perspective on the era that I think is sort of underserved in cinema. So these movies kind of taught me about the world of pop music that I was born just a little too late to experience firsthand. So I got these lessons about them through films that use these songs in very symbiotic narrative ways. And then, like going back into some of the earlier films, I went to talking about like Scorpio Rising, which is kind of like a conceptual art film that also doubles as like basically a not quite feature length, but extended sort of music video essay because the music's the only soundtrack, like the only audio in the entire film, and it's this sort of succession of juxtapositions of late 50s, early 60s pop hits with all this kind of like occult and homoerotic and death drive fascist imagery kind of worked in. And so it sort of opened up this sense of music can mean more than just the surface level that you can kind of like sort of put it on the radio or a jukebox and sort of like pay attention to it on the surface, like things like that, or like how Francis Ford Coppola used the Doors in Apocalypse Now can actually really dig deep into the subtext of a song, completely alter its meaning. And I think that that's probably one of the more fascinating aspects between these cross-cultural or cross-media sort of exchanges is it's like a version of the death of the author almost. It's like, well, the song doesn't necessarily belong to the musician anymore, but it can mean more than what the musician actually intended and add additional layers to it.
Yeah, it was very fascinating reading all those combinations and how they were part of our society. And that brings me to the next question. Music and film are woven into the fabric of our lives, and they can create this common experience for us as a society, especially if we all race and go see the same movies. What film song combination do you think has had the greatest common effect on society?
Well, as far as like society in terms of just the milieu of the entertainment world and show business, I think the way the industry works and the way these sort of unexpected connections can lead to bigger things. The one that comes to mind immediately is what happened when David Lynch used Roy Orbison's In Dreams and Blue Velvet, because there you have a music sync that, first off, it more or less comes about is like an example of inspiration by happenstance because Lynch and Kyle MacLachlan, who plays the lead Jeffrey in the film, they were riding in a taxi cab and Orbison's song "Crying" came on the radio, and Lynch is like, "Okay, this is intense. This is immediately like this operatic emotional song. I need to use this somehow." And he did like later, I believe it was Mulholland Drive, where it was a cover version, but he went to like he got a copy of Orbison's greatest hits, and that's how he zeroed in on In Dreams. Like, oh, this is even better for what I want to envision here. And so he puts it in this scene, this infamous moment where this strange character played by Dean Stockwell you know, he's kind of like this flunky of Dennis Hopper's deranged crime boss, and so like he's like there to perform a lip sync of this song for Hopper's benefit, and he's like singing to this mechanic's light, and it gives him this unreal, almost monstrous cast to it, and Frank Booth is having, Dennis Hopper's character is having this huge, intense emotional breakdown as a reaction. It's this incredible depiction, like maybe the most extreme gut reaction anyone could have to a song in film. And then, it hits theaters, and Roy Orbison, who is something of a movie buff, sees this, and he is like quite understandably shocked. Like he didn't initially, know what to make of it. I believe he was like kind of like I think he went through the cycle of like hating it and then sort of stepping back and mulling it over and realizing, well, this is very effective and transformative, to the song, and it gives it this different cast to it. And also at the same time, he was like kind of trying to get back into the forefront of music. I mean, this is like a couple years before the Traveling Wilburys. I don't know if you could necessarily credit David Lynch with that, but once he like kind of internalizes the effect that this film has had on his song, he and Lynch actually start like collaborating. They like, I wouldn't necessarily say they like get joined at the hip, but they get kind of like this association, because Orbison had to re-record his greatest hits due to rights issues, and T-Bone Burnett, who was producing the sessions, actually brought David Lynch into the recording studio to be sort of like a vocal director, sort of overseeing this new, but this version of In Dreams that is technically a re-recording, but is sort of meant to sort of stand in for the original and basically replicate it in an effort to get, and so Lynch is there to kind of like get Orbison into the right place and mindset to perform it at the same heightened level. So you go like going from a film director using this song as the part of the mise en scène to the guy in the studio, like kind of like seeing how the performance actually unfolds and kind of having a say in it. And then the music video for that version comes out, and it literally incorporates footage from Blue Velvet as sort of like a backdrop. So there's this association that's formed, and it becomes so indelible that when Orbison passes, the memorial concert that was held in his honor actually concludes with a performance of Stockwell. He's reprising his lip sync routine. It's just that only this time it's a completely different emotional feeling. It's like a surreal form of acknowledgement and mourning.
Very good. Thank you so much, Nate. I'm going to move on to Mary and Ned. And I'll start with Mary with this next question. Since both of you were longtime employees of the Northern Water Smokehaus, what inspired you, Mary, to become involved in the development of the cookbook?
Sure. So yeah, so I was a longtime employee of the Smokehaus, for sure. I started just a few months in to the beginning of the storefront of Northern Water Smokehaus. So that was way back in 2001, summer of 2001. So even before 9/11. From the very beginning, the word was really important to the Smokehaus. I think one of the reasons I was hired there was because I had already established a reputation as a food critic, as a food writer. And so Eric Goerdt, the owner of the Smokehaus, knowing this, kind of jumped on me and said, "We need cheese descriptions. We really need to sell all these weird, unpronounceable cheeses, these exotic foods to the citizens of Duluth and like these tourists coming through in Canal Park. Give it all you got. Get that language in there that engages folks." And so I did, like with pleasure, just really jumped into that, and learning, nuances of flavor profiles and cheeses from, Calabria, etc. And the more I did that, the more expansive we became, right? So it like developed into marketing materials. It developed into sandwich descriptions. It developed into naming. The Smokehouse takes tremendous pleasure in its naming of its products and its sandwiches. A lot of times the names of the sandwiches will be unpronounceable, much to the delight of everyone, right? Like customers are kind of like in on that, like fun with wordplay or like stumbling over, you know, these items that should be kind of like commonplace, like mundane sandwiches, relatable. And so it's always been just part of the Smokehouse culture, right? The word writing. And so, you know, when you ask that, it's like, I don't really remember a time when a cookbook wasn't something on the distant horizon. It was just, it just seemed so obvious. But another part of that is that we never wanted to force it. Like we never wanted to just kind of push out this item to sell, you know, during the holidays or something. Like we really wanted it to be this organic gesture and a true reflection of what the Smokehouse is, which is so incredibly difficult, right? Because things are always changing. The Smokehouse isn't just one thing. So difficult, you know, charge. And so something that I think that I stayed back from a lot, just kind of skirted around, wrote around, created, you know, blog pieces. We created a catalog at one point, you know, tried to put some things together into a semblance of maybe something like a cookbook. And then, you know, we had a really, really good team. Like we had Ned, who is a writer. We had an illustrator. We had a tremendously talented designer. And once we kind of had those teams and really had time set aside for the creative process in general, the talk around the cookbook became pretty serious, I think. And, you know, we kind of reached out to some folks in the publishing world, reached out to University of Minnesota Press, and they were interested. And then it was like, okay, this is getting real. Can we do it? And can we do it meaningfully and beautifully? And it really, it felt right. And that being said, like from those conversations with the publisher until the time the book was published, it was like 4 years, 5 years. So we still really took our time wanting to gather and create something that was meaningful and a true reflection.
Thank you. So Ned, same question. So you were a longtime employee of the Northern Water Smokehouse. What inspired you to become involved in the development of the cookbook?
Yeah, I still am here. I went to school for English, focused a lot on creative writing. Always loved writing. And then I graduated and I never really did anything with it. I kind of got more interested in doing music, trying to make a music career and, you know, paying the bills with a job at a deli. And then just kind of through osmosis, I think Mary started to notice that I was like good at writing. And at the time, she had become the GM of the business. And she had me write a blog post. I think the first one was like explaining to people how to survive a summer line at our extremely busy deli. And from that, I just kind of like, I started a weekly, or I continued a weekly blog that Mary had started where we talked about 5 things that happened at the Smokehouse that week. And some of them, sometimes there was a lot of stuff to write about, and sometimes it was like totally a stretch and I had to make up some interesting stuff or like create some new bit of lore. And it just kind of was a natural fit. And then I got the opportunity to start working on the social media team. And by having a little bit of time away from like the deli and the kitchen work, I had more time to focus on the writing. And it was right off the tail of that catalog that they did, which is a really beautiful little piece of work that kind of is like a smaller version of what we did with the cookbook. And I had, you know, the hours to dedicate to doing the archival work and to kind of paring down the recipes from like mass production levels to like home kitchen levels. And from there, I mean, I was a core part of the team. But yeah, just, always wanted to be a writer, never really took the opportunity, and then got a really great opportunity and went with it.
Great. Thank you, Ned. So the next question is kind of a two-part. So I'll ask one part to Ned and one part to Mary. So Ned, with decades of recipes and menus items to choose from, how did you choose which ones to use for this cookbook?
Yeah, there's an interesting story there because when we started pitching the cookbook idea, we had this, we called it Preservation. That was the working title, was Preservation. And the idea was that it was sort of like a double entendre of like, food preservation as an act, and also like just preservation like of the legacy of the business. And even like Duluth itself is a town that like still has some architecture from like the earliest days that, people care about, that become like historical landmarks. Just kind of like all of that snowballing. And so we initially went with like this idea of like, we had an anchor smoke recipe that sort of was like the underpinning of every chapter, which we did from very early on. We did it in that seasonal layout that it is. And so we focused on like the brined and smoked and fermented and dry cured and all of those sort of things, excluding other types of recipes, like a plated meal or whatever. And after a little bit of that, it became a little bit boring. It wasn't quite enough of a draw in. It was kind of like more advanced stuff, and we wanted to make the book a little more accessible. And sometime in the process, it's all a little bit of a blur. The publisher was like, the University of Minnesota Press was like, preservation, it's not it. We're going to figure out something different. And they gave us a lot of different options for titles that many of them we didn't like. We finally settled on Smoke on the Waterfront as the title. And then it just kind of became, what are the best recipes of what we have? Because we have, like you said, decades of recipes. We've done like galas. We've had things that we would never in a million years actually make in here because we don't have the infrastructure for it, and people wouldn't necessarily want to buy it, but they're good recipes. And we started testing them all. And sometimes they were really, really good. And sometimes we were like, okay, that might have been good then, but it must have been by some strange magic, because it's just not, we can't repeat it in the way that we had it then. And so those were the cuts. And then occasionally, we had like recipe contributions from people who came here and had like a very specific impact, like a baker that we had who would make like, specialty desserts for us. And, they would leave the business, move on to other things. And we're like, well, they're not quite, the Smokehaus at that point. So we'd make those little trims there. And finally, we got down to, I think like, it's like 120 recipes or whatever out of maybe like 200 or so that we initially had ready to start writing around. It's the best stuff. It's the stuff that is the most reflective of our space. Pretty much anything in the cookbook, I shouldn't say anything. Many of the things in the cookbook are things that you could come to our store and purchase right out of our deli cases or have on a sandwich. But yeah, I mean, it could have, if we had different moods someday or more time or whatever, we could have had so many other different things. We do dry cured, salumi, and when we started thinking about putting that in the book, we realized it would be like a whole other like chapter length section because of the safety concerns. And one final point that Mary reminded me of is we wanted this book to be accessible to pretty much anybody. Like some of the things that we do here, you really need a lot of space to do, and a lot of like really climate controlled space, and a lot of safety precautions. But we wanted this book to be something that, even if you live in like a studio apartment with like a little Weber grill on, your fire escape, you could go out there and like smoke a piece of fish the way we would. So
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Mary, the Smokehouse has been around for many decades, and there had to have been an original menu that they developed. And I'm curious if any of these recipes from the original menu made it into the book? And if they did, why? And if they didn't, why not?
Okay, so great question. So the Smokehouse's menu, I mean, it's a deli, right? And then it has a little sandwich menu. And the original menu for the Smokehouse had a bagel sandwich that had smoked fish and cream cheese on an untoasted, like, Lender's bagel, basically. And the current, like, version of that is a bagel called the Northern Bagel, and it's amazing. It has, you know, a scallion cream cheese schmear and a lovely, like, toasted artisan bagel and smoked salmon. We do have the recipe, all the components for the Northern Bagel, aside from the bagel itself, are in the cookbook. So I guess, like, it's kind of cheating, but I guess that original recipe is in there. We are really, really proud of the smoked fish recipe that's in the book. It is actually really difficult to find solid smoked fish recipes because it really varies according to the fish that you're working with, and a lot of other things like temperature, humidity, you know, the smoking apparatus you're working with. And this is pretty much ironclad. So you're gonna, if it's a Northern Bagel that you want, you'll get it. Some of the things that were on the original menu, like, included this, like, this salmon wrap that, I'm sorry, Eric, if you're watching this, wasn't that great. Like, it had our smoked salmon pate, it had cucumbers chopped up and then bell peppers chopped up, and some vinegar. And I think it was really good when it was fresh, but, you know, a couple hours in, not awesome. That's not in the book, so it didn't make it. But our smoked salmon pate recipe is in the book. So, you know, really everything in there, like Ned said, like, we really tried to, and it was difficult, tried to translate all the recipes for the core, like, deli ingredients into, like, what a home cook would be working with scale wise, right? Because we use, like, giant recipes to make batches at the Smokehouse. So scaling that all down, which is really difficult, and then translating it over to what equipment most folks have access to. So yeah, it you know, really stays true to the original Smokehouse, I think, in a lot of ways.
And I would add to that that before the Smokehouse was a deli storefront, it was over in Superior, Wisconsin, in a little business incubator, and Eric was just smoking fish. So, like, the smoked salmon and the lake trout, and I believe the whitefish are all, like, they even precede, like, us having a storefront. And of course, this is well before my time. But other things that are in the cookbook that Eric was doing around that time was the Polish sausage, kielbasa, and the andouille sausage that are both in the cookbook. So it's and the salmon pate, that was another one too. So, like, pretty much all four of, like, the first four things that Eric was even doing are in the cookbook. And then, yeah, it kind of just grows out from there.
Great. Well, I tell you what, you folks, this has been just a pleasure. I had enjoyed the opportunity to read each of your books, and I spent a lot of time looking through them and reading them, and just learned so much about society and music and baseball and food. It just was incredible. As we close, I'd like to thank each of you. You're tremendous, General Nonfiction category finalists, and to all of you watching for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 7th. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 8 others are finally revealed. Join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are just $22, including processing fees. Visit thefriends.org/MNBA for details. Goodbye, and thank you again to our panelists, and have a great evening.